So it's the early hours of the morning here in the UK. I'm following two stories, sort of channel hopping with the news. Breaking news in the last hour of a mass shooting in Maine. Nothing unusual in America, of course, but I think it's probably the worst in Maine's history, certainly modern history. It's a big one, 22 killed and many more injured. Um, what can one say? America, guns. It's just a tragic, tragic, never-ending situation, seemingly. But like I say, I think it's probably the worst in Maine. A lot of these mass shootings tend to happen in Texas, California, and more populous states. So this one was in Maine. The other story, of course, is the war in Israel and Gaza. Um, 700 Palestinians killed yesterday was the reports, and a similar figure in the last 24 hours. Very, very grim situation. In this video, I think this is timely to talk about where I am actually critical of Israel now. An important caveat here. I've made no secret of my views on this particular war and how it broke out. Hamas started this war without question. I'm talking about this October 2023 war. There's no question about that. They decided to attack Israel when the guard was down. It was a Jewish festival. Um, in fact, there are specific reasoning for it from what I heard wasn't about Free Palestine. It was specifically on the grounds of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and their grievances over that. But it was a savage attack, savage, one of the worst terrorist attacks in history. And I think, anyone who wants to condemn Israel outright needs to really, really consider this context. Israel's a small country, 9 million people. This was an attack that was on a very big scale, hundreds and hundreds of Israeli civilians killed, many more kidnapped. Many of those people are still hostages. And everything I say in this video has to be remembered. Israel is still being attacked. As Rishi Sunak said, the attacks against Israel wasn't just October the 7th, they've continued ever since. It's been rocket fire ever since. So, some people may be looking at this conflict and saying just Israel is just waging war on Gaza, but the attacks against Israel are continuing. Very important context. A few other things that have been going on. The aid supplies getting into Gaza. The IDF says the problem there is that Hamas is siphoning off the fuel for their own supplies rather than it going to the Palestinian people. But there is something about this that makes me very uneasy. I mean, we've had now about roughly 10 days of, well, what is it today? 7th, okay, about 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks of this war. Already, depending on the sources you look at, up to 10,000 dead. That's a very big toll for such a short period. To make a comparison, in 1994, Yemen experienced a civil war, and that was pretty costly, 7 to 10,000 dead, and it was over a similar period. So it's that sort of scale. But it's turning out to be the bloodiest conflict in the Holy Land in modern times. But one thing that makes me very uneasy is the mounting toll on the Gaza side. Everyone knows that, everyone who's being objective knows that Israel suffered its worst ever terror attack, and it was the biggest mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust. I mean, 1,400 people in a small country is a massive blow. But there have been thousands of Palestinians killed in the last 2 weeks. Many, many, many children, because it's a young population. Now, whatever moral righteousness Israel has in terms of self-defense, it's very hard to look at those images and not feel deep unease about it. My question is this aerial bombardment that Israel's approaching now? I'm not a general. I'm not a military tactician, but I do wonder how effective it is. Apparently, I've just seen an IDF spokesman speaking on CNN, And actually, Mark Holmes, the correspondent, mentioned that the number of rocket attacks have decreased. So maybe there is some effectiveness in Israel's very hardline approach. But unquestionably, civilians are dying. And Israel can say it's not deliberately targeting them, but Israel knows this is a densely populated area. And it doesn't sit well with me that there is such a high civilian death toll. I mean, sure, Hamas hides behind civilians, but the problem here is for a lot of international observers, it is starting to look like collective punishment. Israel could say it doesn't deliberately target civilians, but civilians are dying in their hundreds, in their thousands. And, there may be Palestinian families with no connection to Hamas. And what's this going to do? It's going to create another generation of hatred. But the reason this is such a difficult situation is Israel cannot be expected to do nothing whilst it continues to get rocket attacks. So my thinking would be, is there not a better strategy than this aerial bombardment? I do wonder and this will be a controversial thing to say, but I do wonder, is a ground invasion actually more likely to be more effective? Because will presumably be a lower civilian death toll from that, because if it's much closer combat, they can say who's a civilian and who's not. And the IDF is one of the most highly trained armies in the world. They will suffer heavy casualties. I think they know that. But the problem is, in terms of the court of public opinion, in terms of world opinion, I think it will turn against Israel. Even Israel's allies will find it difficult to just blindly support Israel's actions so long as civilian deaths continue to mount. They will start saying, we support Israel's right to take action, but this is like a scorched earth campaign. And it doesn't matter if Israel says they take caution, because no one will believe it, even if they do. Justin Welby said something interesting about that hospital blast. He said that there's no evidence that this was an Israeli strike, and it almost amounts to blood libel to say that it was. That was an interesting thing for him to say as the head of the Church of England. One of the recent developments is there's been a big fallout with the UN itself over comments made by Antonio Guterres yesterday, in which he spoke about the October 7th attack not coming out of nowhere but coming out of a vacuum, and as he put it, 67 years of occupation. Well, that's went down badly. Even though Guterres, I watched his speech, he clearly condemned Hamas. Not good enough for Israel. They're saying that he should resign. They're furious. Now, I know that Israel's had a rocky relationship with the UN, and Israel, with some justification, believes that the UN's out to get them. But is this really the time to be calling for the Secretary General to resign in the middle of a war when Israel needs all the positive PR it can get? All that's going to do is look, I don't want to use the word petty in this context, but I think they're just picking the wrong battle, because Guterres wasn't condoning Hamas. Now, maybe it was the wrong choice of wording, but he clearly condemned Hamas. So I think for Israel to be, pushing for his resignation, a lot of people will say, well, wait a second, he condemned Hamas, so why are you calling for his resignation? And I don't think that's a particularly smart move by Israel, even if they are upset about it. I just don't think this is the right time to be calling for the UN chief to be stepping down. It isn't going to happen anyway, because Guterres has won a re-election 2 years ago. I mean, I understand Israel's cynicism about the UN. It's had more resolutions passed against it than any other country, including countries with appalling human rights records. So Israel, with some justification, can say there is a UN bias against it. I don't think they're wrong about that, but I just think they're wrong to pick a battle with Guterres when maybe his words could have been chosen better, but it's very, very unfair to say he was somehow supporting Hamas. I think there's a degree of, because of this context, because Israel is reeling from such a terrible terrorist attack, children slaughtered. I think Israel is frankly hypersensitive at this point, and they will interpret any nuance of neutrality or any nuance of showing the other side as being anti-Israel, and I don't think that is the case. I mean, the controversy over the BBC refusing to use the term terrorist, that really emotive interview with Naftali Bennett, and actually it was also Sky News, but I think the Israelis are not entirely winning the PR battle here, and some of that is from, I mean, what I've always seen with IDF spokesmen and women, they're very skilled at PR. They're very good at communications. They are pretty effective at that. But because this is a particularly, Israel's reeling from such a deadly attack, I think emotions are running very, very high. Now, I haven't equivocated on this. I do not think this is a level playing field of, oh, well, Israel's got one point of view and Hamas has another. I think Hamas is a ruthless terrorist organization. And I think that people have to understand what Israel is facing here. It's facing an organization, a terrorist group, that has a constitutionally stated goal of eradicating the Jewish state. Now, Israel cannot be expected to negotiate with that mentality. And Israel's in a unique position. It's the world's only Jewish state. So after October 7th, I was sickened by what happened that day, and I absolutely robustly said Israel has a right to take action here, and I hope they take out Hamas. And I stand by that. I maintain that position. But I do see a Palestinian child. The death of a Palestinian child is just as harrowing and awful as the death of an Israeli child, and anyone with a conscience should. And whilst this war was begun by Hamas with their brutal terrorist attack, it would be wrong to just dismiss the entire conflict between Israel and the Palestinians as entirely the fault of one side. That would be just wrong. There are things Israel has done that cannot be condoned. For example, the continued settlement building and settler violence. Joe Biden has just condemned this. Some of those settlers are fanatics. They're far-right extremists who do attack their Palestinian neighbours. There's no question about that. And this isn't Hamas fighters. This is just ordinary Palestinian people. They're getting impunity from the Netanyahu government. I think Netanyahu himself is a big part of the problem. Let's not forget, until this war, Netanyahu was very unpopular. Nothing like a war to help out a leader in that sense. But I was just looking at footage from the 1995 assassination of Prime Minister Rabin. And Netanyahu was long blamed for that, not directly for the murder, but for inciting the, neo-nationalist far-right mentality that certainly contributed to it, because it was a far-right Jewish extremist who killed Rabin, not a Palestinian. Basically, there was anger against him signing the peace accords with Arafat. And, he was seen as a traitor by Israel's hard right. Now, Netanyahu wasn't behind the assassination, but I think that his demagoguery at the time didn't help. And I do think Netanyahu hasn't particularly helped the situation in that region with his pandering to Israel's far right. The continued settlement building just hasn't helped matters. And yes, Hamas is a terrorist organization, which is deeply anti-Semitic, but that doesn't condone settler violence. And whilst I do foremost blame Hamas for the humanitarian situation in Gaza, there's no denying that when Israel conducts an extensive air campaign, and it always does every time these conflicts break out, that is going to seriously damage the infrastructure, not to mention the psychological scarring. And it's just a never-ending cycle, because if a Palestinian family is wiped out, you can't expect them to be pro-Israel, or to sort of think, oh, well, Hamas is, the Islamist dictatorship in this area, but Israel's our saviors or something, Israel will also be the enemy. So it's very important, I think, to understand, or to try and understand, that this conflict is anything but black and white. Now, since this began, I've come across people who are just blindly supporting Israel or blindly condemning Israel. I think both positions are wrong. And, you know, one thing that's made me uncomfortable was a lot of things, the mounting civilian death toll, but also the naked anti-Semitism that is very clearly in the anti-Israel demos. I do think there's massive hypocrisy in the Arab world among those many demonstrators among the European left. There was a Norwegian student who held up a sign recently. I think it was in Warsaw actually, but she was Norwegian. She held up a sign with her Palestinian friend, and it showed the Israeli flag being put into a dustbin, and it said "tidy up the world" or something to that effect. And she had a big smirk on her face. And when she was asked about this, she claimed it wasn't against the Israeli people or against Jews, but the problem is that sort of mentality. She then, got into this absurd line about she didn't condone the killing of civilians, but Hamas was fighting back. Now, there is that mentality among a big portion of the European left and pro-Palestinian supporters, where they'll put that caveat that they don't condone the killing of civilians, but then they'll wear paraglider outfits and basically they will support Hamas. There's a very, very ugly side to this. And this, partly explains why Israel is so sensitive about this. There's unquestionably, a deep anti-Semitism in the anti-Israel lobbies. I'm not saying that everyone who is in those lobbies is an anti-Semite, but I think it is there. Of course, there's Jews who are critical of Israel. There's left-wing Jews in America and elsewhere who are very critical of Netanyahu, of Israel, and of Israeli policy. But nobody, whether they're left-wing or right-wing, or pro-Israel or anti-Israel, can look at what Hamas done and justify that in any way, shape or form. But just to conclude this, where do I lie? I guess I've changed my position somewhat over time. I remember about 15, 20 years ago, I never support terrorist groups, but I was of the view that Israel was, occupying force. It was humiliating the Palestinians, persecuting them. Then I realised it's actually more complicated than this. And the issue about Israel's security cannot be underestimated because it's in a unique position where its very existence is constantly threatened. Unique among any other sovereign state, except maybe Ukraine at the moment. But, Russia stands alone largely with that, whereas a big chunk of the Arab world will go along with Hamas's stated goal. Then you have the likes of Iran that is stoking the flames. But Biden was right when he said the settler violence isn't helping matters either. Recently, it's also been reported that there's been a rising number of attacks on Christians in Israel. They've been spat at, they've been assaulted. Unquestionably, within Israeli society, there is a far-right Jewish extremist component, without question. They're ultra-religious, they're fanatical, they're really no better than Islamists. They're hellfire and brimstone, they're racist, they're very toxic individuals. They're just as bad as any Islamist. Of course, the difference in Israel is it is genuinely a much better democracy than most of its neighbours, but it's a flawed democracy. And, what has Netanyahu done about this rise of extremism? I'd make a comparison actually with India. India's the democracy, but there's also been a rise of Hindutva extremism there. So simply being a democracy isn't enough. There has to be, the rule of law, and that has to be seen to take effect. Otherwise, minorities will feel they're being oppressed. So, in conclusion, I don't unsay anything I've said. I still believe that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself. It cannot be expected to just have a ceasefire with an organisation that wants its destruction. But I would, at this point, seriously reevaluate this aerial campaign and this kind of scorched earth policy, because it's killing civilians. And Israel may say that's not deliberate, that Hamas hides behind them. That is the reality. It's killing civilians en masse. Excuse me. And if I were an Israeli strategist, I would say, is it important to get the world opinion on our side? And if they're, I think they're maybe taking the view we don't care about world opinion, because this is a battle for survival. So the rest of the world doesn't have to worry about this. But the fact of the matter is, Western countries give millions and millions in support to Israel, the United States well over $1 billion. So it's valid for allies to ask Israel questions on these lines, and to push them to take as many precautions as they possibly can. So long as Hamas threatens Israel's very existence, unfortunately, I don't think this is going to end. But Israel should do more to allow aid in. They did prolong that. And then, they asked people to move to the south of the Gaza Strip, then they bombed that as well. So I think Israel is starting to lose the PR war on this. And, it isn't just from the usual anti-Israel people. I think there's a lot of people like myself who support Israel in terms of its right to defend itself, but are very uneasy about the images that is coming out of Gaza. How does this end? I think it will end up in some sort of ground invasion. I hope Hamas is taken out, because I think they're the single biggest barrier to peace in the region. But after this, I hope Netanyahu is kicked out of office, because I think he panders to the far right in Israel. I think Israel needs another Rabin, or at least someone to that effect. Maybe not a pacifist in the mold of Rabin, but maybe someone in the middle. Not someone of Netanyahu's mold, but not a Rabin either. Maybe someone in the middle. But I think this will have political implications in Israel itself. But anyway, that's my take. I believe in Israel's right to exist. I believe in Israel's right to defend itself. And I believe that there is unquestionably anti-Semitism in some anti-Israel sentiments, without question, and it's vile. People in London tearing down pictures of missing children is disgusting. But I do not blindly support Israel. I do not agree with everything it does. I think